Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome. It's so lovely to see some familiar faces, many unfamiliar faces. I'm so glad to welcome y'all to the Memphis Jewish Community Center. My name is Rabbi Schacter-Gampel. I'm the director for the Center of Jewish Life and Learning here at the JCC. Welcome to the gallery space. It's, I think, arguably the best space in all of the JCC. Every month, there's a new kind of art show, and it's really lovely to have classes, conversations, anything here. So it's so lovely to be here. Welcome. You're here because either I invited you or Wendi invited you. And so it's so great that you've all decided to come. For us Jews, today is one of those days where you start to panic a little bit because Passover is coming. Passover is always coming. It's always looming on the horizon. When is it going to happen? But it's actually really going to happen next week. It's going to start. It's Wednesday evening, April 5th, I believe, if that's correct. And so that means that there's a lot of preparations to do for Passover. There is cleaning of your house. There is making sure that you have, invited folks for your Passover meal, your Seder. It's menu planning. It's, figuring out all these different types of things. One of the things that I think Jewish folks tend to perhaps not spend as much time is in the spiritual preparation. I think sometimes, and you don't have to be Jewish or not, but you get so focused on the task at hand that you forget how to prepare to get to the thing that you're actually doing. You're focused on fill-in-the-blank, exciting life moment, and you're kind of put all your energy to that, and you forget, where am I in this? What am I doing? How am I feeling? And so I think oftentimes, for any of us, depending on whatever we're doing, whatever life stage, it behooves us to prepare a little bit. And so that's my hope for this late afternoon, early evening, is that whether we're Jewish or not, the story of Passover, the story of Exodus means something to us. And so I hope through our conversation, through hearing from Wendi, we can prepare for Exodus, prepare for Passover. Many of you know Wendi Thomas. Maybe if you don't know Wendi Thomas, I'll make sure I prepare and I have her official bio that we'll read. But I thought if we're going to think about freedom and we're going to think about Passover, there's no better person than to invite Wendi to join us and share her thoughts about what is freedom? What does freedom actually mean? And I think it's particularly important at the JCC, at the Jewish Community Center, for Jews to open themselves up to people who are different than them in the hopes to hear a different perspective. I think that Passover, like many holidays, we've got a lot of good thoughts about it. And you can say, hey, well, I've been doing the Passover Seder for generations, for years, right? And that's lovely, and I love that too. And I think it's important every so often to maybe think, how could I celebrate Passover differently this year? Maybe there's a thought that I think about this afternoon, and I will bring it to my Passover Seder with my family or my friends next week. So that's my hope. Wendi C. Thomas founded MLK 50, Justice Through Journalism, in 2017 as a one-year project that grew into a nonprofit newsroom that focuses on poverty, power, and public policy in Memphis. Previously, Thomas was Metro columnist and assistant managing editor at the Commercial Appeal. She has also worked for the Charlotte Observer, the Nashville Tennessean, and the Indianapolis Star. Thomas was a 2016 fellow at the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard University. When she's not touting the benefits of talk therapy, happens to be my mom's a therapist, my sister's a therapist, everyone in my family is either a therapist or a rabbi. So,
and that's part of
a
rabbi.
Yeah, exactly right. It's basically the same thing. The therapists are rabbis and the rabbis are therapists. But when she's not touting the benefits of talk therapy, she's learning to play tennis and giving scritches to her dog, Ben. So let's give a round of applause and welcome to Wendi. So I think when we've encountered Wendi, we've encountered Wendi through the written word and through probably really important ideas and arguments and articles that she's written. My hope is that, I'm assuming we'll get there, but my hope is to find out more about the ideas and the personality behind those things and kind of leading up to that. I think so often especially now, we're clicking, we're jumping, we're kind of immediately judging, but we don't get a chance to actually know the person that we're hearing from or listening to. So before you kind of jump into that, I thought it would be great if you could tell us about your life. Tell us about your family that you grew up in, your influences that you have.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for this invitation. I'm really happy to be here today. It's such a beautiful day outside. And so I'm grateful that you came out in the sunshine and came in this space. My primary influences, I think like a lot of y'all, would be my parents, who are here today in the back. My mom's on the front row. She's the A student on the front row. And then she deserves a little clap. And then my father is there on the back row. My sisters are here with me today, and my niece and nephew, the little contingent over there. So it's really nice to have all my people with me here today. My biggest influences, like a lot of y'all, I'm sure, are my parents. I was really, really blessed to grow up with good, caring parents who are stellar examples in different ways. So I will not talk about the spankings I received because I don't know how central they are to my identity. But my mother, like a lot of your mothers, is just a really selfless giver. I was talking to my sisters yesterday. She has a saying about money that I'm sure she didn't invent, but with money, you save some, you spend some, you give some away. And so we've always been raised with the importance of giving to others, charity, and I think I see that in shows up a lot of ways in my work. My father is also kind, but a little more stern, and he, I think, is where I got a lot of my critical thinking skills and how I question systems. And so my father is retired now, but he was a professor at the University of Memphis for 26 years. We all went to elementary school at campus school right there on University of Memphis campus. And so I can remember in the mornings we would drive from our home in kind of the Bartlett area to school, and we would listen to NPR in the mornings on the radio. And my father sometimes would turn the radio down and then give me his take on what had just been said. And so I think I learned from that there are different ways to view the same story. There may be more of an official narrative, and then there might be one that's rooted more in a perspective of how does this impact the least of these or the most marginalized among us. And so I'm taking this, what my mother's planted in me about giving and caring and giving back to others, and then what my father's kind of is instilling in me in terms of examining systems, and it melded, I think, a lot into who I am today.
And is there a moment, maybe a turning point or turning points in kind of where you kind of conceived of, hey, this is what I want to be doing in the world. This is what I want to be, how I want to act.
Yeah, so I think that there's, so I went away to college at Butler University in Indianapolis, where my mother also graduated from, and I thought I was going to be, I'll get to the turning point for it, but I thought I was going to be a pharmacist like my mother. I don't know why I thought this, because I've never been good at math or science. And so my freshman year, I'm taking like intro calculus, one of the classes you would need to get a pharmacy degree, and I was doing horribly, which in our family is a C. So I was going to get a C, and best case scenario. And I was there on a scholarship, academic scholarship, and I was worried about this. And so I'd always liked to read, and so I thought reading and writing are kind of the same things, and so I switched my major to journalism. from pre-pharmacy to journalism. And that was the depth of the thought that I put into becoming a journalist. Like, I didn't write for my school paper. It just wasn't something that was on my radar, but it turned out really, and Butler's not known for journalism, it's known for pharmacy and like arts and that sort of thing. And so I switched my major to journalism. So one of the classes that I was taking maybe my sophomore year was a sociology class. And I loved it so much I remember calling my dad and telling him, oh, maybe I'll be a sociologist. And he's kind of like, do you want to starve? And I was like, no, not necessarily. Like, all things being equal, I would like to eat regularly. But the professor was Dr. Marvin Scott, I remember. He was a really like politically conservative guy. So you might not expect some of the assignments he gave us. And this turning point for me was this assignment he gave us in class where he gave each one of us a family structure. And then you had to go out and figure out how were you going to make ends meet for this family structure with a minimum wage job. Mm. And so I was a single mom with 2 kids. There was like one in elementary school and one in middle school. And so I had to figure out to get them to different schools in the mornings. We had to figure out where we were going to live. So this is back in the days of actually newspapers. And so you pull out the apartments section of the rental section of the newspaper and you try to find, okay, this address with my budget, I could afford to pay this for rent. Here's where the bus routes go that I'd have to take to get me to work. We even had to go so far as to plan a menu with prices. So like, what are you going to cook for the week? So maybe you're going to have, I don't know, we used to have this meal I used to really like called macaroni beef saute, I don't know. So how much is the ground beef going to be? Like your tomato sauce, paste, noodles, all that. How are you going to do that? And what I realized then, although I didn't have the words to say this, people often say that systems are broken. I don't know that that's completely accurate. Systems are designed to do exactly what they do. And it was very clear to me in that moment that there was no way to make it work on minimum wage as a single mom with 2 kids. It cannot be done. It cannot be done. I grew up, the daughter of a professor and a pharmacist. We weren't rich, but we were never poor, right? And so I think about that a lot. I took a class in Memphis. It was the Memphis School of Servant Leadership. And one of the things we had to do was be in relationship with, and this definition of poverty stood out to me, people who were poor or who had been made poor. And the idea of some systems making you poor just really stuck with me. And I think once you start to see these things, you see them everywhere. Like, if you're shopping for a new car, you see the cars everywhere, right? You're like, oh, okay, like maybe that. But when you start to look for systems, processes, institutions that make people poor, they're all around you. And once you see them, for me, I can't unsee them. They're just there.
I think that's gonna probably connect exactly into how we frame Passover. Once we hopefully start to think about liberation, think about what it means to be in Egypt, whether that's actually historically in Egypt or in a contemporary Egypt, so to speak, it would make us need to think about that it exists everywhere.
Right.
So everyone, either you sat on a little piece of paper or you have a little piece of paper in front of you. So during Passover, during the first evening of Passover, the first 2 evenings of Passover, there's a ritual meal called the Seder that Jews participate in, and it's a really amazing experience that is food and song and ideas and ritual and all that kind of combined together. It's just one line, but it's the line that stands out to me most, and I think the line that I think Wendi, you were just speaking about, but I think we need to kind of think about it a little bit more. It says, in each and every generation, so this is the text that the family or whoever's around the table will say, in each and every generation, a person must see themselves as if they have left Egypt. In each and every generation, a person must see themselves as if they have left Egypt. So you already started to talk about this in terms of seeing systems around you. But I guess first just initial reactions to, not initial because I shared this text with you before, so it's not like I'm not putting you on the spot.
Right.
Don't worry, she's not being put on the spot.
That's why I had notes.
She knew this line of the Haggadah already. But well, yeah, just some initial thoughts.
Yeah, so I think, each and every generation, the first part of the phrase, the sentence, I think to me reminds me that it's not something that we acquire and then it's there forever.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that has to, this search for freedom, this identifying with people who are not free is a continual thing. It's not something, my parents took care of that, we're done. And so that's kind of what that said to me. And then, seeing yourself as if you've left Egypt, to me says, I'm identifying with the stranger in the land, the people who have been oppressed, for whatever inherent purpose, identifying with the outcasts. And it really feels like forcing yourself to have the imagination that, but for the grace of God, there go I, and everyone that out there that is the homeless people at the interstate. If you ever go off Sam Cooper right there at Highland, there's always somebody there. Realizing that could be me or somebody in my family. I'm not so smart, learned, disciplined or anything that could not be me. That's kind of what that says to me. And also, and we didn't talk about this when we talked before, but the Exodus, that was a journey. It was a journey that they were on. And I think also being a reminder that where I'm at now is not where I have to be. So if you are in oppression or you're wandering or you're suffering, that is not a permanent state. So there's no permanent success, no permanent comfort, but also no permanent failure. That it can be, it's fluid. It's always,
Great. There's a number of really beautiful pieces. I want to kind of take each one at a time. So the first one is intimacy, is realizing that either I could be that person or someone I love could be that person, or it's really not that far for me to be from where I am, let's say in the car, to where that other person is at the crossroads or in Egypt or whatever you want to. How do you help, I guess, remind yourself of that?
So I think some of it is not letting people become invisible to you, not letting homeless people in particular become something you don't see, like where they're part of the furniture, or you won't even make eye contact. I won't say that I give money every time I see somebody. I try to be discerning. It's not like a good idea to roll down your window every time you see somebody and start handing a 20 out or whatever. I think that's part of how I remind myself, even in giving money, not judging how that money might be spent. I think a lot of people don't give to homeless people because they're saying, they're going to spend it on drugs or alcohol. If you have a severe alcohol addiction and you go to the hospital, they give you beer, right? Because if you're trying to detox, you literally cannot just, it's hard on your body to stop, right? And so, I don't let people become invisible to me. Resisting judgment, I think, is part of that. And I think particularly in this kind of politically charged, divisive climate, there can be lots of reasons and justifications to, they wouldn't be poor if they worked harder. This is a symptom of laziness. Just slight detour. When I was at Harvard, I had the opportunity to take a class called Poverty in America by Matt Desmond. Some of you may have heard of him. He's an author, sociologist. He wrote the book Evicted about housing instability. So one of the questions he posed to us in class that is just in my head now forever is, what if poverty isn't an accident, but it's a robbery? What if poverty isn't an accident, but it's a robbery? And if poverty isn't an accident, but it's a robbery, that means there's thieves. There are thieves. And so I think not to remove people's agency or the power to influence their own lives, but being mindful that this is something that has been done to someone else. But if I'm not currently suffering, what is my obligation? Now, what is my obligation to these people?
Wow. Is there, in terms of the I guess I would call it, sum it up in terms of the grace that you would try to give another person, how does that play out in your work?
Oh, yeah.
Maybe there's there's a particular example of, when I was working on this story, this happened, but maybe just in general, when you're working on a story, there are individuals in that story. How do you navigate that by giving grace to the people that you're writing about or investigating?
Right. So that shows up in our work, I think, in the kinds of stories that we choose to tell. When I launched MLK 50 in 2017, I really wanted to force the community to consider what we'd done with Dr. King's sacrifice. I mean, he came here to support striking sanitation workers. That was the only reason he was in Memphis. He did not plan to be here. He was working on the Poor People's Campaign, fittingly, and took a detour here, was asked to come support this movement. And so focusing on low-wage workers has always been a part of our focus and what we choose to write about. We focus, as you read, we focus on poverty, power, and policy. And that power part is really important. So not just who has the power to shape other people's lives in ways that can be detrimental, but what power do these marginalized communities have in terms of movements and mobilizing to seek their own freedom. So that could be tenants unions. It could be the LGBT community, which has been fighting out against a lot of this kind of hateful legislation and efforts coming out of Nashville. There's just lots of ways that people are, mutual aid groups that are coming together. So the power of systems, but also the power of the people. And I think that's like one of the ways that shows up in our work.
Let's go back to the journey then. One of the things that when I first shared this text with you over Zoom, I guess a couple of weeks ago, or maybe more recently than that, we write, in each and every generation, a person must see themselves as if they have left Egypt. I think the first comment that you had is said, it doesn't say anything about the Holy Land. Mm-hmm. It just says that they left Egypt.
Right.
And I've thought about this text for my whole life. And I've never thought about that line. That it's just about leaving Egypt. And I think that there's something there about that it's about being able to take that first step. Mm-hmm. Which I think which in some ways is so challenging, but on the other hand is actually in some ways freeing.
Yeah.
Because if it's just the first step, then I don't have to necessarily worry about the promised land, whenever that's going to come 40 years later,
right.
Or whenever, who knows what they even knew then. But also on the flip side, the reminder then that I could be back in Egypt. Mm-hmm. That it's kind of there's a cyclical journey to it.
Right. Seasons.
Yeah.
To it. Yeah.
So I guess for me then the sense of journey and the sense of in each and every generation. So you see yourself as in some ways a continuation, right? You had mentioned MLK 50. This is this. So how do you see yourself in kind of that arc, like where you are, where the past has been, where you're hoping the future, like how do you see that?
How do I navigate that?
Yeah.
So, I think they're different tools for liberation.
Okay.
King's was definitely more direct action, getting out in the street, legislation, that sort of thing. As journalists, we don't advocate for a political party or candidate or that sort of thing. We're there to shine a light, to expose. I think that, I'm thinking about what comes forward. We very much lean on not just Dr. King's teachings, which just about all of which I read before I launched MLK 50, but also Ida B. Wells, who many of you are also familiar with. She is often credited with being one of the country's first investigative journalists, because the investigation she was doing into lynchings across the South and trying to debunk the notions that black men in particular were just especially violent, and that's why these kind of extrajudicial killings were taking place, but to expose that it really was this mob violence. And so she has records of who was killed when in the South, published these, and for her courage was run out of Memphis. So her, I'm sure all of you maybe seen the Ida B. Wells Park now downtown, and there's a little statue of her. She's just a little bit shorter than me, so I kind of identify. I'm yay, short people. And so that is also part of our heritage and our lineage, kind of that we have. I think going forward, at MLK 50, I'm already thinking about, it will be 6 next month, who succeeds me? How can we train the next generation of journalists to dig, to look for these systems, to examine where power is not being used on behalf of the most marginalized people, and probably in ways that aren't the format that I grew up doing. I'm an old newspaper hack, so it's the written word, but now it's more videos, and how do you educate people through TikToks or more on social media, and so, but it's the same goal to have a more educated populace. Ida B. Wells said, the people must know before they can act, and there's no educator to compare to the press. And so that's definitely part of how we see our role in, these stories, I think, that we do, and I can give an example, can help people get free. Yeah.
I think I'm very taken with the line that you just said in the middle there, or you're already thinking about how to create an institution without you.
Yes.
I think that
yes.
So often, whether it's someone who's creating an institution, whether you're a father and a family, it's about me.
Right.
It's about how I am a good dad. And it's well, wait, is that? Yeah, it is, but it's imagining a future where you're not necessarily going to be there. And I think I'm thinking about if Jews are celebrating Passover and they're thinking about how they cultivate or work on or act on a sense of freedom, it's what they can do now, but also what they can put in place for that their children and grandchildren or their community members can also think about how they do that. Because in a generation, they're also going to be saying the same exact line. In each and every generation, a person must see themselves as if they left Egypt.
Right.
And not that it lacks hope, but that it's just aware of the reality that there's going to be these kind of ebbs and flows, these waves.
Right.
And I'm sitting with that I should work hard towards what I'm kind of advocating for, but at the same time being aware of the fact that I'm not gonna be the one who takes them to the promised land.
Right,
or to the,
right. I may not make it in.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know there's a scripture. My mother will probably correct me because it's been a long time since I went to Sunday school. But the idea of leaving an inheritance for your children's children, and I think I've typically thought of that in terms of money. Like, Dad, are you going to leave something for your grandchildren? But what would a social justice inheritance look like that you inherited from your fathers? And we're definitely trying to implant that in my nieces and nephews.
Mm-hmm.
Because maybe that's richer than money. Maybe that goes further and lasts more than money.
And maybe I'm just thinking out loud because you're saying it, I'm just taking it in, that maybe that's for Maybe that's the point of the Passover Seder, is that you gather together as family, as friends, as community, so that you can take stock of where you are and then think about, hey, what are the things that we need to be thinking about or working about this year or the coming year? And that's that moment, once or twice, let's say the Jewish New Year is a time of introspection. It's a time of thinking about, okay, you've made it through the year. Who am I as a person? Maybe then Passover is the way that we think about, freedom and justice every year for how we're going to kind of keep that for our communities or generations to come.
Yeah.
Wow. So one other piece of the freedom that you've talked about is then freedom also then needs to be channeled into something. But it's not just, you can't just be free, but it's free to act towards something. So what, I guess, how do you understand that moral responsibility?
Yeah, I meant to look up who said it, but the concept of no one is free until all of us are free, and not being able to revel in your liberation as long as other people are suffering, and particularly as long as other people are suffering and you aren't trying to do anything about it. You're enjoying your freedom, and overlooking others, and your role in helping them escape whatever systems there are, but not just helping people escape. I kind of like, what was the saying? I didn't say this is not my words, but if the issue is justice, charity is sin. And so the idea that we're changing things so we don't have to have food banks. We don't need clothing closets. We don't need those kind of supports, because everyone has what they need in their jobs and their lives to thrive. I think that's
and kind of. Wow. And then what would you? So all of us here, we're not all journalists. So what's the? How do you think about shaping that mission or call to different individuals?
People in the community, people?
Yeah.
Or, so I think it probably would go back to, looking for us in a city that is as poor as Memphis. We're one of the poorest large metro areas in the country. Just over 1 in 4 residents lives below the poverty line. And that's a sizable percentage of people. And I think, again, looking for the ways in which people have been made poor and being aware of that, and then telling the community about it. So I'll give one example, if that's okay.
Please do.
So in 2019, I did a big investigation into the debt collection practices of Methodist Lubana Healthcare. I came across the story because ProPublica, which is a large investigative newsroom based in New York, had written a paper about racialized bankruptcy in Western Tennessee, which there was a story about it. There was also a white paper, kind of about the methodology and stuff. And I am just so nerdy that I like reading white papers. And I'm not just reading the paper, but going down the rabbit hole of the footnotes. You know what I mean? And so I remember there was a footnote that said one of the leading causes of bankruptcy, particularly in this Western Tennessee bankruptcy district, was medical debt. So this is a footnote in this white paper. And the way it was written, I could tell there's some data behind that. It didn't say what the data was, but I could tell somebody quantified this in some way. And so I emailed the reporter and said, this one line, what's the data there? He's like, oh, you want the data? I'll send you the data. Like this massive spreadsheet of data. And so I'm going through these, the Shelby County General Sessions court records for people who are being sued for debt of all kinds. Lots of car loans, credit card stuff, but also medical debt. And of all these lawsuits in medical debt, Methodist by far sued people more often. So I went to court right there at Adams and, what is that? Is it Washington? Yeah, right there at Adams and Washington. If any of you are familiar with Brian Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, he talks about being your proximity to the people who are suffering. I have lived in Memphis just about, I think it's maybe about 11 years, since 1980. I had never been in that courthouse. I had no reason to go into that courthouse because I'd never been sued for unpaid debt. And so I went into the courthouse and I just would go to court and watch people try to defend themselves against these lawsuits. Almost all of the people who came, who were being sued, defendants, were black, and the majority of those were black women. And they're facing off against this hospital, this healthcare institution, faith-based healthcare institution, with their team of lawyers, and they had like a team of like, I don't know, some other folks there, and these people don't know how court works. And they're facing off with a judge who is very chummy with the lawyers, because the lawyers are there every week. Like the defendants come once or twice or what have you. On one of my first trips to court, I met a woman named Miss Carey. Miss Carey very much reminds me of my mother. Very modest, long skirts, no makeup, no jewelry, just very whatever. Miss Carey had been sued for unpaid hospital bills for surgery she'd had in, I think, 2007, I believe. Her bill was $12,000, but because of interest and debt and attorney's fees, it had swelled to over $33,000. The judge had ordered her to pay, I think, $100 a month. Often she didn't have it, so she would take out payday loans to be able to pay the hospital. Sometimes the hospital would garnish her paycheck. In Tennessee, you have to make a certain amount before your paycheck can be garnished. Often Miss Carey, I think it's about maybe $200 a week. Often Miss Carey didn't make enough for her paycheck to be garnished. And there were literally thousands of stories like hers. When she was ordered by the judge to pay $100 a month, if she paid as ordered with the interest continuing to accumulate, she was 90 years old by the time that she paid off that debt. So when you talk about if poverty isn't an accident, but it's a robbery, Methodist was a thief. Nonprofit hospitals are granted nonprofit status under the, not assumption, the requirement that they provide some level of charity care. Methodist charity care policy was stingier than any hospital in the region and most in the country. Another way that Methodist was unusual was that they sued their own employees. So I remember one week I went to court. Methodist sued so many people that one morning in court, the whole docket was nothing but patients. Patients whose mistake was being poor and sick at the same time. That was their mistake. And so it would not be uncommon to go to court and see people in Methodist uniforms facing off against their lawyer. One woman I met was Miss Marilyn. She was a hospital housekeeper. She owed the hospital $23,000. And the year prior, she had made $12,000. So she owed more than double what her income had been the year before. She was making $12 an hour at the hospital. It was stunning and staggering. And I spent months and months in court meeting people, watching how the system worked. And then wrote this investigation in partnership with ProPublica. Methodist never would talk to me, never would sit for an interview about the story. But we just had story after story and the data from the court records to back it up. One of the things I learned from reporting this story is that shame is a very powerful motivator. And after the story ran, the hospital felt a lot of shame, and there was a lot of backlash. They got a lot of feedback from their doctors, from board members who didn't know that this was happening. It was invisible. It was a system that was happening in this courthouse, chewing people's lives up. But because I didn't know anything about it, and wouldn't have if I hadn't gone down the rabbit hole in the white paper to see a line that didn't have data and then ask somebody about the data. So I talk about like being proximate to it, but also being aware and looking for it. Because once you start looking for it, it's everywhere. So we published the story, and within a few weeks, Methodist stopped suing people in court, halted their debt collection activities, and then they announced a raft of sweeping changes. So they raised the pay of their lowest paid employees to $15 an hour. They said they would not sue employees anymore, period, full stop. They overhauled their charity care policy so that it was twice as generous as before, making it one of the most generous in the region instead of one of the stingiest. And they ended up erasing nearly $12 million in medical debt for more than 5,300 defendants. Impact that exceeded my wildest imaginations. And because this was policy change, remember the power of poverty and policy, there are people who will never be sued by Methodist because they're not doing that anymore. They've changed how they operate. And when I think about getting people free, debt is a burden. It is a millstone around people's necks. And there was no way these people were ever going to get out from it. It just wasn't going to happen. They were going to take this to their grave. And so when I talk about journalism being a tool for liberation, that's what it can look like, right? It can literally get people free. There were, my sister actually is a school teacher, and she was talking with a teacher, I guess like the beginning of the school year that she hadn't met, and she asked her like, tell me about you or whatever. And the woman was saying, I was so excited. We were able, me and my family just were able to get a house. They wanted to have their own house for a long time. Once this debt had been erased, these negative credit items were falling off her report. And so her mortgage lender had told her, your credit's too bad to get a mortgage. You just aren't going to be able to do it. But once these items came off her credit report, the mortgage lender called her back and was like, hey, you qualify. That woman never read the story. She didn't know anything about what had happened. And so we don't do this work so that people will know that MLK 50 did it or I did it. We do it because we want them to be free. And I'm just, it's an honor and it's humbling to be able to do that kind of work, right? And it feels like I'm paying it forward, I'm applying the spirit of generosity and caring that I got from my mother and the very critical look at systems of power and oppression. And this is my work for my generation, right? And there will be generations that will be spared that, but there will be other work for other generations to do. And every once in a while, I still check the court records just to make sure Methodist hadn't started coming up again, because you have to fight for freedom. It's never, it's not done. And so that would be one example.
Wow. I mean, I had a feeling that example was coming, just from the research that I had done from you and your work. But I think that's a wonderful place for us to kind of close and summarize, is that, well, wow, I'm just kind of sitting in that story and the amount of people that it impacted. I'm thinking about all of the different elements to freedom that we've kind of been discussing so far. The hard work in terms of the looking up that footnote, the ability to show grace towards these people, to show up in the courtroom and not look at that other person and say, oh, they must have done something wrong to be in this bondage, so to speak. And then the ripple effects that it causes, that from the work of one person, they can kind of help all of these people become free in some sense. And as you concluded just there at the end of the anecdote, was that, and we have to keep on doing it. Mm-hmm. One, to check back on the court records to make sure it's not happening, but also because there's going to be something else that we're going to need to work towards. Right. That it's not just because we did this amazing work, it's not just done. It needs to continue to be worked on. Yeah. There's a lot more to talk about, but I want to be respectful of people's time and give folks a few minutes just for some Q&A if they want. So let's kind of pause and conclude here. Let's offer a round of applause. Let's take maybe 10 minutes of Q&A. If folks have a question, feel free to raise your hand. I'll call on you, and we'll answer. Yeah, Jonathan.
So, Wendi, I'm curious. First of all, I think it's ironic that, as a recovering journalist myself, I chose to avoid sociology for the great riches of journalism.
Right. I'm rolling it now, yeah.
But I'm curious, you talked about trying to avoid judgment, and you talked about trying to impact change. You started, looking at 2017, 5 going on 6 years. When you look at just a microcosm of our city, and you look at almost the reverse in so many areas that we seem to be going in instead of forward moving, what gives you hope that, aside from the incredible work that you've done on so many things like Methodist Story, that really, you said, may change now into the future, but what gives you hope that collectively we can impact change and we can be less judgmental when it feels like as a society we're more judgmental than we probably have ever been?
Right.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh,
Sure. It feels like in some ways we're moving backwards. How do you continue to cultivate hope?
Yeah. I've had people say, I would support MLK 50, but the work you do is too negative, right? Like you're looking at the bad things. And I will say, the Methodist Story was very critical of the hospital. It was not a bad thing to the people whose debt was forgiven, right? For them, that was a very good thing that happened. So I don't think journalists are negative. I think we're eternal optimists in a way, because we would not do that. We would not do this work if we didn't think change was possible, or if we didn't think things could be better. What is the saying? The arc of the moral universe is long when it bends towards justice. Sometimes it does not seem like it's bending at all. I think of the regression we've had in reproductive rights, in voting rights, all the legislation that's been passed. The Tennessee legislature is just remarkable in the preemptive legislation that they will pass. So Shelby County actually wanted to have a living wage ordinance. I don't know if you were on the commission back then, JW, but the legislature, in response to that, passed a law saying that municipalities can't have a living wage ordinance. So even when you might have communities that want to do the right thing, or might want to take those steps, the legislature will say no. They say they won't do that. But I was talking to someone the other day. Republicans have supermajorities, not to make it political, in the House and the Senate, but it makes it just very difficult for progressive policy to advance in any way. But he told me if we flipped, if the electorate flipped 9 seats in the House, it could be different. I was like, wow, 9. Like, I can count that, you know what I mean? Like, that would feel, that sort of thing gives me hope. There are people out there on the front lines all the time agitating. You've seen it a lot following the Tyree Nichols case, and sort of the demands that are being made at City Council in terms of police policies, procedures, particularly like traffic interactions. That gives me hope. I wish we didn't have to be motivated to be particularly active by the sacrifice. I mean, we would not be having these conversations if Tyree had not been beaten to death by police. I wish we could act without those. But that's kind of history, right? There are these crescendos and then the wave kind of recedes a bit. I think it kind of relates to what you said earlier, you're not thinking about the 40 years, you're just thinking about what my next step is, and then you take the next step. One of the stickies I have on my bedroom mirror is like, what's the next right step? That's it, right? And that, I'll say 83% of the time keeps me from despair.
Awesome. Any other?
What makes a true journalist? Meaning, like, you a journalist, so why do you think you have to have integrity when you're doing stories in general?
Wait, say the last part again. Why do you think?
Why do you think you have to have integrity? I might not be saying it right when you're doing stories. Integrity. Honesty.
Yeah. So, often people will say, "Oh, this is unbiased news. You're getting this news that's unbiased." I kind of reject that notion because we all have biases. And they'll show up in different ways in journalism. So one of the examples I like to use is when I was at the Commercial Appeal, there was one person who covered K through 12 education in all of the Shelby County, one person. If you went to a Grizzlies game and counted the number of journalists that were there, you might have 6 or 7, right? If budgets are moral documents, as has been said, help me remember the name of the Reverend Barber, William Barber says that if budgets are moral documents, the CA is telling you what they value, what their bias is toward, by how they've chosen to allocate their resources, right? So there are some issues, I think, on which there's not two sides. Housing is a human right? People should have access to health care. They should be able to make enough money to live on in your job. Those are non-negotiable, so I am biased toward that, right? I think what journalists need to do, and that speaks to the integrity part, is to be fair and to be accurate. That's what we want to do. So if I'm being critical of Methodist, I'm going to give Methodist repeated opportunities to explain themselves. In investigative journalists, most of us practice a no surprises policy. So whoever we're writing about, we do not want you to be surprised by what you read when it's published. And that, I think, speaks to the integrity. I think there are some news organizations that may play a little more fast and loose with that. But I tell people what we're selling is credibility. And once people don't believe that what we're saying is true, we're done. It's a wrap. They have no reason to engage or to take us seriously. And so people joke with me, they're like, your receipts have receipts. So if I say something, I can show you exactly where that happened, what's the data behind that. And I think increasingly now, again to the integrity thing, transparency is also part of it. So explaining to readers how we did this story, who we talked to. In the Methodist story, Miss Carey, I wrote about all sorts of her finances and that sort of thing. She gave me copies of her tax returns for me to review, her pay stubs, her bills, her apartment lease. She signed consent for me to get her medical records. So I could see all this stuff. So I was not going by what she told me. I was going by what I could prove. We didn't put her tax returns online, of course, but that thoroughness and attention to detail creates the kind of journalism people can trust and be motivated to act on that as a result.
Maybe we'll take 2 or 3 more questions, and then, yeah, sure.
Wendi, did I understand you correctly to say earlier that you're about to start thinking about your succession plan?
Yes.
Wow. Such a young lady, and you started to think about that. So my question is, thinking about your time with the CA, and then when you actually started this in 2017, I have always saw you as this journalist with high level of integrity, holding people responsible. What would you do after being a journalist? What would your next life look like, next job look like?
If I don't hit the lottery, or marry really well, I don't know. I think I will still be a journalist, maybe just not at MLK 50 immediately. Yeah, it's just what I do at my core.
Okay.
Yeah, I just really can't imagine doing something else, but I might go to work for ProPublica. A lot of founder-led organizations struggle when the founder gets older or maybe doesn't leave in time or lets things get stagnant. But again, thinking about the legacy, to me, MLK 50 isn't a success if I can't leave, right? Yeah. If it can't survive me, then we've failed. And I want to create opportunities for the next generation.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mike.
For those of us that have lost track of you, JW said this. Tell us what this is, what your organization is, and if you don't mind, do we sign up for emails, or how do we keep track of you afterwards?
Yes. So MLK 50 is a nonprofit newsroom. We're primarily supported by large foundations and grants, primarily national grants, because a lot of people in Memphis who have the money, they profit from the status quo, and I'm here to dismantle it. And so if I were FedEx, I just did an investigation to a worker death at FedEx. If I were FedEx, I wouldn't give me a dime, because that does not spare you from anything. So we have a team of 9 people, most of them here in Memphis. One of them is Melanie Gaines, our audience engagement editor, who's here with us today. There's sign-ups.
See me after if you want to sign up
for our newsletter. We have a free newsletter, and if I didn't say this, being nonprofit is that we always provide the news for free. So there's no paywall. Anybody can access the information, and we rely on generous donors to keep it going. We have 2 reporters, and then me. I'm getting to do a little bit more reporting now. We focus primarily on housing issues right now, labor and criminal justice.
Oh, thank you. Pansy, did you have any?
I'm curious as to what your take is. I very much value your idea of how journalism should be, and I'm curious as to what your take is on where journalism is currently, including Martell, what we see on TV, under the auspices of journalism.
Of news, yeah. When I was at the Commercial Appeal, I think circulation was maybe 300,000 on Sunday. Now I think it's under 40,000. And so the number of journalists there are to keep people accountable has shrunk dramatically. It is shocking. And there's actually research, quantitative research that's been done to show that as the number of journalists shrink in a community, the bond rates go up. And so it is costing us money. The municipal bond rates go up. And I can look up that study and send it to you, because receipts, I always keep the receipts. And so it is costing us money. This decline in journalism is costing us money. TV news, I don't want to dump on my broadcast brethren and sistren. It's very much, if it bleeds, it leads. There's not a lot of substance there. I was in the airport recently for an early morning flight and was just sitting there and watching the local news. And the crawler about all the crime and shootings and car thefts, and I thought if I consumed this every day, I would never leave my house. I would be terrified. So I really limit my consumption of local broadcast news for my sanity and to preserve my hope. I think one thing that's really important to remember when we think about crime news, it is very cheap to produce. The police send you a press release, you go to a scene and you get this little footage of flashing lights and maybe some crime scene tape, and you're done. You never know what happens you rarely find out what happens to these people afterwards. You're rarely informed of whether the victim and the suspect knew each other, because a lot of crime is about proximity, and a lot of it is people who have individual beef. So you may be less at risk than maybe what you would be led to believe you are, just going to the grocery store, what happened. Although there are random crimes that are happening that are abhorrent. But I think MRK 50 sees ourselves as part of a larger media ecosystem and adding some context to things you might see on the news. So one just quick example I'll give in closing. We're all familiar with what happened with Tyree Nichols and the Scorpion Unit, which ostensibly was supposed to be patrolling high crime neighborhoods. And our housing reporter was actually out of town when the video was released. But when he got back to the office, he was like, that's not a high crime neighborhood. And it had just been repeated as fact. Police said Scorpion is for high crime neighborhood. So everyone's like, oh, okay, this must be a high crime. It was not a high crime neighborhood. And so our reporter went back and looked at crime data to show that there were actually more car thefts in Midtown than in this neighborhood. There were far more homicides in parts of Frazier than in this neighborhood. So that's why I think we're trying to differentiate ourselves and also provide that context so we can have that, hold people accountable, but also have that hope.
Yeah. It's a lot to process. My hopes are that we continue to individually or as friends and family or community, continue to process that as we lead our way to Passover. But again, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon, and have a good evening.